Okay, hi everybody. I think that's my cue to start. My name is Craig Campbell. I'm one of the founding members of Ethnographic Terminalia, and was invited to play the moderator today. I'm also a professor at UT Austin, where I participate in the Bureau for Experimental Ethnography and run the intermedia workshop in the Department of Anthropology. Excuse me. So I was really excited to come on board, partly because I actually gives me a chance to focus more clearly and purposefully on a set of films than normally would be the case. So it's great to be here. I don't really have a sense of who's out there aside from the other or from the directors and producers who are on board right now. But can everyone hear me? We got a thumbs up out there. Yeah. Okay, great. So we've got 5 people involved in 5 films, although there's a number of other films that were sort of collected under this title or organized under the idea of ethnographic reading. And this was billed as a conversation for exploring how culture is embedded, reproduced, documented, and described by documentary art. There's a few things I'm hoping to get out of the way at the start, and I'll do introductions in a second, that we can sort of circle around to if folks have questions. But one of those is border crossings and policing, what actually gets to count as ethnography. So as far as I'm concerned for this conversation, and again, this is just my personal position as a moderator, is I'm not particularly interested in moderating or in policing that term too much. Although if we want to circle around and talk about it, that's fine with me. I think there's a lot of other interesting things, parallels, connections, questions and ideas that come out of these films, and that I'm keen to hear from in terms of what the filmmakers and writers have to share. So let me just start quickly with an introduction. First on the list that I have anyway is Toma Peu and Luisa Parvo, who are filmmakers for Civilians. Toma is a filmmaker, visual artist, media scholar, and educator, presently pursuing a PhD in emergent technologies and media arts practices at the University of Colorado Boulder. Toma's work as an artist confounds with his scholarly interest in identifying new modes of expression by engaging technologies of various generations in theory, inhabiting liminal disciplinary spaces across the arts and social sciences. And Louise is a lecturer in the critical media practices in the College of Media Communication and Information, University of Colorado Boulder. Now, by the way, I'm going to really keep these short. You can look up the directors and more detailed biographies later. So the next is Till Trojer. Till, maybe you can pronounce correctly for me.
Troje, but it's okay. Yeah.
The Afar Salt Trade of Northeastern Ethiopia. Till is a German documentary filmmaker, director, and cameraman, currently living and studying, doing a PhD in anthropology and ethnographic film at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London in the UK. Then we have Marty Reardon-Smith, director of A Love Letter to the North. And Marty is an Australian anthropologist currently completing her doctorate of anthropology at the University of Sydney. Her research practices incorporates multiple mediums, including film, photographs, paintings, poems, letters, drawings, as well as more traditional anthropological field notes. Through these various mediums, Marty aims to create an archive of experience. Now, there's actually, let me just sort of insert here as well. One of the reasons I didn't want to just sort of associate each of you with an institution is I think the ways you've articulated your fascinations in these biographies are actually really informative and rich. And so that's why I'm taking a little bit of time at the start here to actually read from them. Then we have Clate Corsant. Is that right? Or close enough?
Yeah, it's Clay.
Clay, okay. A writer-producer for Lifting the Green Screen. And Clate's a New York City-based cultural anthropologist, currently teaching at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and he holds a PhD from Goldsmiths, University of London. Clate's taught anthropology courses at Goldsmiths and Bard College's Bard Prison Initiative. His dissertation, Environmentalisms in Practice, from National Policy to Grassroots Activism in Costa Rica's Osa Peninsula, from 2018, came to the premise for Lifting the Green Screen. In particular, Clayt has developed scholarship at the intersection of political ecology, environmental theory, social political justice, and conservation. And then finally, we have David Marino, director of Talamanca. David is a visual anthropologist who says he cannot live without traveling, living stories, and the sound and colors of the sea. He pursues film through film of personal enrichment so as to reveal to himself and others the magic of the real. His cinematography revolves around material attunements, asking the viewer to imagine together the endless possibilities of life and lives. Okay, did I miss anyone? No? Okay, great. Hi, Toma.
Hi, sorry. Problem with the internet over here.
Okay, well, again, I'm not entirely sure who's out there in the audience, but for anybody who I cannot see, welcome to this discussion. And please post your comments on the side, and I'll try to pull from them and ask them collectively. I've got a couple, sort of a strange interface here, so I might be jumping back and forth a little bit between the actual interface and our discussion. So the place I want to start off from today is actually a question about audience. And it's a way of stepping around for me, this question of policing what gets to be called ethnography and not ethnography. And there's a bit of a dance, I guess, we're performing here, or I'm performing here in terms of moving around how we're defining ethnography. And partly I want to come at it firstly by thinking about audience and the ways in which audience produces you as filmmakers, and the ways that you anticipate an audience when you're going through the process of creating a film, from conceptualization through filming and editing, etc. And then finally the circulation of it. So I just wanted to put that out there just to get things started, and I'm very curious to hear what y'all think. I don't know a particular order, so and I'm not sure if we can lift hands here, so I guess I'll just leave it open. So does anyone want to start by talking a little bit about audience and how that affects their practice as filmmakers, and if specifically if we can speak to the films at hand too.
I don't mind, adding my ideas here. And first of all, thank you for having us on this panel and having us on this fantastic festival as well. And I'm just speaking from a perspective from my field work and my film, and how I made my film about one of the last salt caravans in northeastern Ethiopia. And my entire research was based on, informed on participant observation, ethnographic research before I started making the film. So I didn't come with the idea of making a film to the field. It just developed while I did my year-long field work with certain communities in the northeastern parts of Ethiopia, close to the Eritrean border and not far from the Red Sea coast. And the audience that I had in mind first and foremost were the people I made the film with, right? So my idea was first, and I think as anthropologists and ethnographic filmmakers, we are enmeshed in this triangulation between the communities we work with and then the audiences. And oftentimes the communities we work with are the first audiences we have to think of, right? And specifically in my case, because it was clear that this long trade, the caravan trade, would disappear at a certain point. We wanted, or there was also the wish from this community to preserve part of this history through film for following generations. So I think from an anthropological perspective, or the way I view it, I think the first audience, and also from an ethical responsibility that I keep in mind, are the communities we make these films with.
Great, thank you. That's a great response. And actually, in many ways, Till, it was your the film you made was Arho, right? That got me thinking about audience in particular, and some of the ways you talked about how the Ethiopians you were working with were, choosing the music or choosing the participating in constructing the soundtrack that you worked with. So I guess for me, this is interesting. How are we composed as we address an audience, right? How does it basically interpolate us in one way or another? And what are the sort of imaginaries that are moving between ourselves as creators and the people we're engaged with? I'd love to hear anyone else who wants to sort of elaborate on this theme.
I'll speak if that's okay. Thank you again for having us. Yeah, similar to Till, the first audience I thought about was my research participants, but less in a kind of trying to preserve anything sort of sense, and more because I wanted to make my research accessible back to the people I was working with, and the vast majority of those people are not going to read my PhD thesis. So I think seeing themselves in the film is some small way of kind of having a sense that they have some ownership over the research.
A sense that they wanted something in particular from it, or that it, in doing that, sort of imposed limitations on it or challenged you with certain kinds of constraints. For example, I don't know, maybe it prevented you from making a weirder or more experimental, strange film, and it was something a little bit more recognizable to that community.
No, not really. I think, yeah, I don't think it really changed how I made the film or what I kind of felt like I wanted to include. I suppose there were certain things that people asked me not to film, but I might not have filmed them anyway. No, I think, yeah, it was just more, and I don't know how much my research participants would really kind of enjoy the film I made, but it was more about trying to be transparent and kind of feed back to the community as much as possible.
Does anyone else have anything to add on that?
Well, first, thanks for having us here, and thank you guys for your beautiful films that I've enjoyed a lot. And I think there's something really interesting here, because when I think about our audience seen through my film, I have to inevitably to think about an academic audience, as I produced my film as a part of my PhD, but I also liked to think about a more extended audience that is, I don't know, festivals, or we might imagine documentary TVs. So the idea of the audience is very much related to bring something that is really not seen, or just use field work, or use this kind of posture that you have to produce something that is not seen elsewhere. So this introduced I don't know how to say, but probably is, how can we combine art and ethnography for a wider audience, but also to stay within the boundaries of scientific production? I think that was quite a challenge for me, because I tried to melt the two together. So I don't know, this is something really challenging, I think, for ethnographic film.
Well, David, if I can push on that a little bit more, I'm curious if the people in your film Talamanca, if they have seen it, and what they thought of it, and actually also partly I'm actually curious about the actual sites of exposure. Where are you actually sharing these? What's this sort of cinematic encounter in the field itself, if it's happening in your case?
Well, the main character, Houston, the main character of the film, he managed to saw the film via a messenger Facebook connection through his son, who lives in a nearby village, but no one else has seen this film apart him, no one in his family. So I don't know if that's an answer to your question, but I think it was more than this. So he saw the film, And the son told me he was really surprised to see himself in that kind of in that kind of atmosphere. I'm trying to use the word his son used to me. So that's what he said. He was very surprised of the atmosphere of the film.
Great, thank you. Anyone else? Clade?
Yeah, I'm thinking along the lines of community as the audience, or the community that we work with as kind of the primary audience. It's especially when you're looking at activism, you kind of get into this sticky situation where they want to know, the people that you're working with, if you're in the fight or not, and how you're going to represent the fight, especially if it is a fight, and if you are talking about inequality and injustice in some way. They want to know what side you're on and how you're going to represent their side. So there's a lot of ethical matter to take into account, and how you present that information, how you present not only their image but their voice, and what it is you're amplifying and why you're amplifying it, and if you're trying to set it up for a critique, or if you're just fully 100% behind them, or even, and maybe especially, if you're trying to be neutral and kind of a fly on the wall and just present it like you're opening up a window into their lives, even though you're talking about social justice or socio-environmental justice issues. It's really something that's, I think, always there, and just nagging on us, to kind of take into account in some way.
Yeah. Well, so Clade, I'm curious, I think back to this famous film by Edgar Morin and Jean Rouch, what's it, 1961, God, I'm forgetting it now, Chronicle of a Summer. And there's this sort of famous scene where about midway through the film, they bring back everybody we've seen so far into a theater and show it in front of them, and then film their reactions to it. And you get these little battles and dramas opening up. And so I think actually, attending to these sites of actual encounters, in David's case, you're talking about this, mediated through the son's, computer, where, he's actually seeing it, and then, sort of thinking through, what is this device and what is this actual historical moment of encounter with this narrative you've produced that's now circulating all over the place. So, I specialize in work in Siberia. I've, very little context for really understanding what's going on. And, equally, I'm sort of like touching this thing from afar, right? And wondering what this is and who these people are. And, I salute all of you for creating these really rich and beautiful documentaries that push me to not think that I know everything now, but actually ask more questions and push me to sort of go farther. And so, both ethically, I'm concerned about, what does the community think of it, right? What have they seen of these things? But also then, how does it travel and how's it being encountered? And then the next question, which I'll get to in a second, is, how are we accountable for that? And how do you think you're accountable for the limits of those kinds of interpretations? So, Clayton, let me ask one more question off that. Then I want to switch to Louisa and Toma and ask them the same question. But Clayton, do you have any sort of scenes where you have, or that you can recall for us or recount for us, where you actually have had those kinds of encounters, where you've played it and you actually get, large community feedback or individual community feedback in terms of, what is a very sort of politically challenging situation in the Osa Peninsula?
Well, see, that's the thing. You also have to think about which community it is, because even though it's a tight-knit community, and there, in terms of people living on the Osa, there aren't many more than around 10,000 or so. But there are many different communities within the community, and many different opinions within even a family. We had one scene where there's a group of campesinos sitting, and they're discussing recent politics of land use and changes towards tourism. and the daughter had a completely different take than her father. So there's a generational difference. Even within the same family, you get a different perspective on not only conservation policy and what the land means and how to use the land, but also incoming globalized economics like tourism. So this new industry is taking over, especially in Costa Rica. There's a generational change, and so one person may feel more excited about the way that's presented than someone else, and we've seen both. You know, I mean, when we're critiquing institutions, the people that work as bureaucrats won't be as enthusiastic about that portrayal, or they might feel a bit defensive, like as if they want to include a little bit more. Whereas, you know, other activists feel like, oh, we didn't push far enough. So there's a lot of different opinions to sort through. I mean, you can get lost in trying to accurately represent what everybody feels and thinks, to the point where it's almost impossible.
Yeah, for sure. And so there's actually a component of that I want to pin for a second and come back to in a minute, and that's sort of managing the disappointments of others who wanted you to make a different movie for any number of reasons. And I think this is a way to get into inquiring after some of our own motivations. But I want to come back to that in a second. So Toma and Louisa, I'm glad you're able to join us. So your film captures this sort of remarkable pre-COVID world. I mean, they all do, but there's something about the just sort of letting it play out in a way of, for me, or maybe it was just the moment that I saw it that I was just sort of struck by social proximity, and maybe I got used to it by everything else. I don't know. At any rate, you know, for you, you know, how is the audience creating what you're doing, and how are you thinking about that?
Toma, you can start if you want.
Yeah. No, I'm not sure really. I think for me, it's important to think of filmmaking, but also writing and other acts of expression as forms of relationality, as forms of mediation and encounter, and that applies to the making. That applies to the concept, to the moment when you plan what you're going to do, or when you decide where to place your camera and what to do with it. But it also applies to the moment of sharing and showing the work at a specific time. So I'm glad that you made that reference, Craig, because this morning I was actually just skimming through our own film a little bit, because I hadn't revisited it in a while, and it also struck me that the relation that I now as a viewer have with those spaces, and with tableaus, with the urban tableaus that we sought to capture in civilians and to store, is fundamentally changed. It's fundamentally altered. And to me, it's really important to keep in mind when you make a film that that encounter will always be different. So if your film is able to speak enough so that the encounter, so that the relation remains legible and can somehow be facilitated, but not that much so as to stifle communication or to run to verdicts or to run to conclusions, to preclude alternative understandings or representations. In other words, to block the encounter, to block the relation through too much maybe explanation, or through a form that is prescribed, through a form that only allows us to see it in one way. I think that's basically audience making, this awareness of relationality in the process of making, but also in the process of sharing work across space and time.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
So,
I
Luisa, do you
I
want
could add
to?
something. To me, it's more important to do the work. So at that point, when we shot civilians, it was very important to capture those streets, those corners, those stores, those people, because they will disappear, right? They are disappearing in New York. Everything is transforming and changing so fast due to gentrification, or especially due to that, but through other things like COVID or natural disasters or stuff like that. So for us, it was very important to document those places in that exact moment. And I don't think we were concerned with audience then, but I think a film, as Thomas said, has a different value once the time passes and once you revisit it. And I think our film, as many other films, will find their audiences. And of course, this is not a way to do it. You should be concerned with audience when you make something. But in my case, I'm usually concerned with what I would like to express in that exact moment, and then think about audience, or how do I want to bring the work out so it can be seen by others. So.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I've got a slightly different, I don't have any questions, by the way, coming in off the feed. So if anybody out there in the audience world has questions, please go ahead and type those into the interface. So I want to first of all open up to everybody else in the room here. Is do you have any sort of cross questions or thoughts about things others have said in terms of what we've just gone through with this question of audience? No. Till, go ahead.
Oh,
okay.
no.
Maybe what we'll do, if anyone has anything to say, just raise your hand and then I'll name you and then you can speak. How about that? Okay, so let's do this sort of next move I'm thinking of here. And that's, we've sort of imagined an audience now, whether the audience is the so-called community, as Clate's done a really nice job of, is challenging us, I think, more than ever. We've been challenged to recognize the fact that we can no longer sort of work with the traditional mythologies of, you know, what an audience is or what an audience knows. It's so fragmentary, and anthropologists and filmmakers can no longer be confident that they can make a movie somewhere and then, you know, never show it to that community again. You know, people are going to see these things and they're going to come at them from lots of different kinds of positions. So the we of an audience, or even the they of an audience, is put into I think radical suspension. And yet we put things out there in the world with a certain sort of set of expectations that the world is coming to it with a certain kind of generosity, a certain kind of fascination. So what, and this is a general question for all of you, is what do you do when, or how do you respond to the needs or the desires of people you've represented through your filmmaking that are not the same as your own interests and fascinations? How do you manage these sort of expectations and desires as a filmmaker? Because at some point we're still holding on to being creative producers, and maybe just to feed it a little bit, I'll give an anecdote. Is an old professor of mine, I remember, telling me that, you know, not all of my work as an ethnographer needs to be activist work. There's other ways that I can actually give back to a community. And often we get lost as creators in trying to sort of assume what a so-called community or a group of people or an individual might need or might want. And that the thing that is able to sustain us as creators, as writers, as filmmakers, is our own passion, our own set of fascinations. And so there's always these kinds of trade-offs between the needs and desires of people who've been represented or who appear on film, as it were, or been mediated, and our own desires and fascinations as creators. And we've got a remarkable range of films here to look at, from this kind of ficto poetry almost from David's. You know, I get the sort of magic of your main character sort of descending into the water and coming out again. I mean, just so beautiful and playful, you know, to this like powerful activist sort of documentary that Clayton is working through in the behind the curtain, lifting the green curtain, sorry. So yeah, so how do we respond to these things? How do you think about these things, your own relationship? Till, go ahead.
I may, if no one else wants to speak, I just had an idea, and I don't just let my mind flow a little bit. So because I think this is exactly the most interesting space, right, where these different perception of actually what makes a good film, where we meet and come together, and where we can have this discussion about what actually makes a good film. Because I think we have certain understanding of how story works, or what makes a good film. We are conditioned how film works, the way, right, starting the way we were influenced, the films that we saw growing up, all of these things we bring into our practice, right? But then perception of how we perceive not only the world but also film is also culturally conditioned somehow, right? So I think this constitutes an interesting space for dialogue with participants to actually sit down already in the field. Right now technology has it possible. You bring your laptop, you make a first rough cut, and this is also from my experience what I did, and I made this rough cut, and I thought, okay, this is actually right. You start with an inciting incident, and then you draw the audiences in, and then you build your structure and your story arc and all these kind of things, and you present it to the people, and they say, what is this? I mean, do you not know how to make a film, right? Their perception was different, and they said, okay, we saw you filming on this hill and having the shots of the community. We want this to be the starting point, right? And then they said, we have this music. So we spend a lot of time discussing these things, but this is where I find the most interesting coming together that opens up different moral spaces for collaboration, spaces for reflexivity in ethnographic filmmaking. And it's just an interesting way to see what kind of films come out of that, right? I would have never imagined myself editing a film to music that was given to me by the participants. But all of a sudden, music became such an integral part of the whole film, right? And in general, there is no such thing as a background music, but because the participants selected these films and said, hey, we want this film in here. So all of a sudden I was confronted. So how do I integrate this music into the film and make it work somehow? If this makes any sense.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. That's wonderful. And actually, there's something out of that as well, which I just want to mention. That which I don't. I've got a few questions I want to go to as well that have just come in, but also managing expectations of people who appear in our films. You know, in my mind, a lot of that's about doing good informed consent. Is actually sort of engaging with a discussion about what a documentary film is, what an ethnographic film is, who's going to see it. You know, I've shot video where, you know, there's this expectation it's going to show on, you know, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation channel, and all Canadians are going to see it or something like that, right? And it, you know, not that it's going to circulate in these sort of more minor and academic sites. So I want to put that out there as well, is how we manage that. But to the first part of that question, does anyone else want to add to that before we move to some of the questions that have come in off the side?
I would agree with Till, and I would actually reference not so much civilians, which was more of a street documentation and observation project. But in my current work in the Uzbek diaspora in Brooklyn, I think doing this for a longer time, having started it 2.5 years ago, I think it's something you realize only gradually once you become part of a group, or once you develop a sort of a fellowship with the people who encounter you and your camera. I think it's really important to, Mary mentioned the word transparency, and I think there are many, obviously, limitations to that, and the word is used in very problematic contexts all around the world and by all kinds of different representatives of different institutions. But I think it's important to be who you are and to own that presence of the camera, not as a sort of concealed weapon, or not as an ulterior motive for you being there, but rather as a part of your body and a part of your brain that is very much also informing this relation you develop with the people you work with. In other words, stepping in and being who you are, but also being this other person with a technological extension, just like other people have technological extensions in their work, just like the salt traders in Till's film have their own technological extensions that they work with when they perform their activities.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's also important to initiate this conversation about image making as labor, or as someone's role, I would say, or someone's identity within a certain group or within a certain room that you might be in. And then this will carry whether you have, this will carry, and this will be a part of your own identity, whether you have the camera in your hand or not at that time. Just like the fact that someone, is a fabulous cook, we know that when they're cooking and when they're not. But we are aware, I think, of a bit of who they are through this kind of professional identity that they inhabit, and it's important for us to assume that as a professional identity.
Yeah, I like that. Good. Luisa.
I would also add, I think it's also a matter of trust, to build this relationship with the participants, but also to have them, like, yeah, as Thomas says, see you work, being there, coming back, and just building this relationship and this trust that develops through the relationship. And I also agree with Till. I think collaboration is very important, but in our work, it's also important for the participants to trust us that we can represent their lives and their actions in a as close as possible to what it is or how we perceive it. But it's very definitely it's controversial because sometimes you might be wrong and or sometimes you might not get it the way they would like, or they come with their expectations. You come with your background, and this also informs the final result. So there are different variables that you need to pay attention to. But I think if they trust you and your work, and if you are transparent, as Thomas said, and if you explain as much as possible what you're doing and showing them the work, they will eventually be on your boat in a way. They will understand what you work with and what you're doing.
Well said. This actually might be a nice place to insert a question we have from the audience. So this comes from Eric Coombs Esmail. And he says, I'm reminded by Baudrillard contending that the disciplinary tendencies toward preservation are not actually for the subject, but rather an attempt to preserve the discipline itself. And he wonders if anyone has thoughts on that.
I have no idea who Baudrillard is, so I have to Google.
We can throw Baudrillard out of this; it doesn't matter. But the key, I think that the key idea here, right, is, if we have, who are we speaking to exactly in the we? And the we right here at this moment is people who are concerned or fascinated with and involved and committed to making documentary films of one sort or another. Are we more concerned with representing and reproducing sort of familiar forms, Or is there something else going on here that, as he says here, is this a tendency towards something that the subject might, or a tendency away from what the subject might actually be interested in or wanting? I think maybe another way, and Eric, you could maybe clarify this if I'm wrong, is, to what degree does our work, even though much of it is very experimental, domesticate the world itself? Bring it back into some sort of familiar form, and we're pushed up against these boundaries all the time when we're saying, should I edit this scene out? It's incomprehensible, or it's not neat enough, or it doesn't fit with the flow of things. Yeah. David, and then Luisa.
Yeah, that's a very challenging question, and I think it's the challenge of every filmmaker, isn't it? It's not just about, let's say, anthropologists who make films. And somehow I learned by doing my film that you need to be obviously a filmmaker first, then you might want to be an anthropologist as well, but also you need to be a sort of therapist, don't you? Because you also need to understand what your subject expects, where he really wants to go, or how does he, in my case, Justo, wants to be represented, right? Because there have been several moments in which, for instance, we, and I say we because at one point I filmed with someone else, with a friend as well, we wanted to film Justo hunting something. And he really didn't want, because he wanted to come out as a conservationist in the film. He wants to come out in the relation with the forest, with its plantain, banana plantation. So there's a lot of balances that you need to find while doing a film. First, between your gaze and your subject gaze, and also obviously your heart and your discipline boundaries. So it's all about this, right? It's all about putting together these small pieces and finding a balance.
Thank you. Luisa?
Yeah, definitely, I agree with that. I'm also an editor, and I deal so much with this fine line between. I'm also shooting, so it's like I wear different hats whenever I make films. So, how do you convey what you experience through your footage, and also then, how do you? I wouldn't want to say meet the expectations, because I don't think we need to meet the expectations of the participants in the way that they imagine the films. But I think it's important to see beyond, and to see maybe sometimes people are not able to see themselves as they are, or like are not able to, maybe they work with the imaginary, and imaginary is important in film, but I'm not going to talk about this, but it's just, you have to be true to what you discover and to your research eventually. And also to deal with the footage, which is something else, and be a filmmaker and kind of balance this, the need of the formal aspect of it, of editing, of taking out of time limitations and all those stuff of out of focus shots, but also deal with what you want to come through it, what you want to express, it's always challenging, and I'm dealing with this right now. I'm editing a feature documentary, and of course, my character, the person in the film, she wanted to be represented in a totally different way, because she had an image of herself, and she always brought those scenes like as a sort of a performance, and you had to dig deeper and to kind of like go beyond those first masks that your subjects put on because they want to appear in a certain way, and go beyond that and try to like dig deeper and see what's actually in there. And this takes time, and this takes a lot of work, and yeah, it's a fine line eventually between footage and representation, and like making a film that is according to your standards eventually, and to what you want to achieve.
Marty, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to that I also think it's a very fine line between creating the right level of intimacy with your research subjects and not exposing people's vulnerabilities. For example, there are certain things in my film that people were sort of, happy to have filmed and happy to sort of have in the film. But I think there's an extra responsibility as not just a filmmaker, but as like an anthropologist and an ethnographer to not expose people and to sort of understand how certain things are sort of seen by a wider audience. So I worked with cattle stations, and I filmed some rodeo sports stuff. And I know some of that footage, it couldn't end up in the film because people not from that area, not from that kind of like world and background, see those relationships, like those interspecies relationships, really differently to how the people who are actually involved in them see them. So there's that extra responsibility to kind of consider whether you're exposing people, I think.
Yeah, great point. I've actually got tons of questions to follow up on, but other people are asking questions, so I'm going to hold myself back. So first, I've got a question from Laurid Son, who says, can you all talk about how you negotiate different potentials of the unseen and the seen in your work? What you choose to leave in, what you take out in shaping your stories?
I can take a stab at answering that question, and I will also tie it in with some thought maybe related to the previous question. I think one way to counter the disciplinary conservative impulse maybe that your disciplinary approach or your professional or your predetermined formal approach might take you into the world with is to not think of preservation as much as memory. I think memory is a more valuable concept to employ when you're researching, when you're filming, when you're having dinner or lunch or working with the people who are your protagonists, but also when you're filming. The fact that filming, recording is the instant production of memory, and that the process of editing is basically the shaping or the bringing to life of that memory, which then gets transformed through viewing it in certain contexts, in certain times, by certain audiences. I think that's something to keep in mind. I think that will maybe help us refrain so much from replicating some prescribed formulas. And that's also how you think of the seen and the unseen in your work, or the things that are explicit and the things that are embedded. This awareness that, after all, memory and art are not meant to spell things out, but they are meant maybe to more to help carry their memory through. And I think that applies particularly to the ethnographic. And I'll stop there because I want to give other people a chance to respond.
Yeah, Clayt.
Yeah, there was in terms of what we felt we couldn't include or what we didn't include. There was a lot of gossip and some biased information, polemic, kind of unsubstantiated claims that we felt like, oh, if we go down that road, we better have a lot more information to back it up, or we have to then present the other side of the story, or then that, just one comment, if we had included it, would need another 20 minutes of historical context or something like that. So we ended up not including a lot of things that we felt were too gossipy or polemical or biased, and it would have changed the tone too much, and it would have done harm to many of the people in the area, and we clearly didn't want to do that, or we promised not to do that.
Mm-hmm. And that actually sort of leads to the last question, and we're actually over time already a little bit, but we can keep going till people leave or we get turned off. I'm fine anyway. So we've got a question that the last one we got was from Iris Khan, who says, "Thank you for your films, which each give meaning using different types of film language." And then with the specific question for Louisa and Thomas, which I think actually is a question that'll fit for other people as well, but is how do you balance letting the audience find meaning with guiding the audience? And I think that's something everyone's struggling with in one form or another, but because it was posed directly to Louisa and Thomas, I'll let you start.
Specifically about civilians, I think with civilians is a little more about letting the audience find the meaning than implying one. But I think for this film, it was also the pace was very important as the images. And so I think this is the only thing we were able to work with. Where do we start the shot? Where do we cut? How long it is? And what mood you get into. So it's a more of a poetic approach, less narrative. There is a narrative because we tried to organize the footage as if it is one day. But yeah, there wasn't much. I didn't want to manipulate as much, even if you do manipulate without even realizing when you choose the footage, when you choose what to show, what to not show, as you said, unseen, seen, what you let out, what you let in. But we kind of tried to stay, to keep a sort of a distance and let the audience lean in and kind of just observe and also maybe get into the mood of the street. I think this is. And
from my perspective, I don't, in looking at civilians, for me it's a very low stakes film. Like it's in the case what Marty was mentioning. You've got histories of indigenous violence against indigenous peoples and dispossession, and there's a lot more care and concern that needs to go in, at least on one level that I'm familiar with, into sort of making and managing those guiding hands and guiding moves and decisions that we make. And so that said, I'm looking at this from a very particular kind of perspective. And we don't always know what we need to take care with, right? And how to take care of these things. So, I mean, filmmaking is an inherently dangerous task. So how do you manage that?
Well, that's something I'm always reminded again in my current research, because part of it is media practice, but and media wants to represent, and we want to be able to find meaning, as Iris is saying. We want to be able to have access to sounds and images. But what happens when the protagonists of your research are undocumented? What happens when you want to be able to share the memory and to share the spirit of a place, but by doing that in a direct way, not in an oblique or maybe more metaphorical way, you might endanger someone, and that's something that's at the forefront of your awareness when you're working with a vulnerable population. In the case of civilians, for us it was very important to find the right lengths and to find the duration, as Louisa said, but also to be aware that the landscapes themselves, the urban landscapes, were the vulnerable populations we were working with for reasons of policing, for reasons of economic, political, social pressures. This was shot in 2015, but these communities had been under transformation for a while, for a number of years. So it was very important not to give it out so that it doesn't feel like now the atlas is complete. Now we know exactly what Flushing was like, what Greenpoint was like in the 2000s, what these other neighborhoods were like, but rather to capture some of the spirit. How do you show enough? How do you represent enough so that you convey spirit and presence, but so that you don't convey mastery over a certain historical or geographical space.
Right. Thank you. So I think we're pretty much at time. Is there any last comments from anyone else before we sign off? No? Okay. I have tons of questions. This has opened up all kinds of things, and it was such a pleasure looking at your films, spending time with them, thinking with them, and actually looking at them in context of all the other ones that were playing as well. I mean, it was really great. So thank you for all your efforts. You've met a great audience here, and I wish you luck with the films and with your work in the future. So thank you all, and goodbye. Ciao.
Thank you very much. It was nice to meet you all.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, everyone.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for your work.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. What a treat.